All right, let's talk about something that's always in the headlines. A number so big it can make your head spin. The U.S. national debt. We're going to break down what this thing actually is, where it comes from, and why it matters. So, let's dive right in.
Okay, just look at that number, $36 trillion. And you know what's crazy? It's going up every single second. It's a figure that's so huge it almost doesn't feel real.
So what are we really talking about with a number that big? What is the national debt? And you always hear that other word thrown around, the deficit. Are they the same thing? Spoiler alert, nope, not even close.
I think this is the best way to think about it. Imagine a bathtub. The total amount of water that's already in the tub, that's the national debt. That's the total stock of what we owe. The deficit, that's the water coming from the faucet right now, this year, adding to the total. So every year we have a deficit, we're just pouring more water into that tub, making the total debt bigger.
So here's how we're going to break this all down today. First, we'll nail down that debt versus deficit difference. Then, we'll get into how the government actually borrows money. After that, a big one. Who do we owe all this money to? Then, why any of this should matter to you. And finally, the scary part. What if we just stopped paying?
All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, Debt versus Deficit. So we've got the basic idea down, right? The tub and the tap. Now let's figure out why that tap is always running in the first place.
Which brings us to Section 2, how the government borrows.
See, to really get the debt, you have to get the deficit. And a deficit happens for a pretty simple reason. The government spends more money than it brings in. So where's the money coming from and where's it all going?
Okay, let's follow the money. First, where does it all come from? Well, you might not be surprised to hear that the vast majority of it comes from us. A full half of it is from individual income taxes, and another third comes from payroll taxes for things like Social Security. What's kind of wild to me is that corporate taxes are actually a pretty small slice of the pie.
Now, here's where all that money goes. And get this, over 60% of government spending is what's called mandatory. That means it's basically on autopilot. It's paying for programs like Social Security and Medicare that are set by existing laws, not by some big debate in Congress every year. The part they do argue about is discretionary spending, things like defense and education. And that last chunk, oh, that's just the interest we're paying on the debt we already have.
Let's put some real numbers to this to make it sink in. Take 2022. The government spent $6.3 trillion, but it only brought in $4.9 trillion. You do the math, that's a shortfall, a deficit of $1.4 trillion in just 1 year. That is a lot of new water pouring into the bathtub.
So what happens when there's a gap like that? I mean, the Treasury can't just print a bunch of money to cover its bills. Instead, it has to borrow. And it does that by issuing things called Treasury bonds. You can think of them as IOUs. It sells these bonds to investors all over the globe, and that's how it borrows the cash to cover the deficit.
And that leads us to the next really big question, right? If the US government is borrowing trillions of dollars, who exactly is lending it to us? Who owns all these bonds?
Okay, so the total debt is split into two big buckets. About a fifth of it is what's called intragovernmental debt. This is kind of weird, but it's basically money the government owes to itself, like when it borrows from the Social Security Trust Fund. The rest of it, the huge part, is public debt, and that's the stuff held by people, companies, and other governments all around the world.
Now here's where it gets really interesting. There's this common idea out there that most of our debt is owed to countries like China, but the reality, it's actually not true. The majority of the public debt is owned right here at home, by the Federal Reserve, by American banks, and yeah, maybe even in your own retirement or pension fund.
Now, that's not to say foreign countries aren't big players. They absolutely are. Japan and China are the biggest, both holding over $1 trillion each. So why do they buy so much of our debt? Well, for one, it's seen as one of the safest investments on the planet, but it's also strategic. When they buy US bonds, it helps keep the dollar strong, which makes the stuff they export cheaper for Americans to buy.
Okay, so we're talking trillions of dollars, investors, foreign countries. It's all very high-level stuff. But let's bring it back down to earth. What does any of this mean for you? Why should you actually care about the national debt?
Well, it matters because of something economists call crowding out. Think about it. When the government is borrowing trillions of dollars, it's competing for a limited supply of money with everybody else. And when there's that much demand for borrowing, it can push up interest rates for all of us. That means it could get more expensive for you to get a mortgage or a car loan, or for a small business to get a loan to expand.
And then there's just the jaw-dropping cost of it all.
The US government is spending more than $2.6 billion every single day just to pay the interest on the debt it already has. Just think for a second about what else that money could be paying for.
And this is where it gets really dangerous. It's like a snowball rolling down a hill. The debt gets bigger, which means the interest payments get bigger, which makes the debt even bigger, and so on. In fact, these interest payments are now the single fastest growing part of the entire federal budget. It's a cycle that leads to a pretty terrifying question.
What if we just didn't pay? I mean, what would actually happen if the United States government decided to default on its debt?
You have to understand, the entire global financial system is built on one core belief. The United States always pays its bills. US bonds are the risk-free asset. They're the bedrock that everything else is built on. So, what would happen if that bedrock just crumbled?
Well, it wouldn't just be bad. It would be a complete catastrophe. A cascade of failures. Your retirement savings, your 401k, could be wiped out. The Social Security Trust Fund would become worthless overnight. Banks, whose safest assets are US bonds, would start to fail. The US dollar would collapse, global trade would freeze up, and you could very well trigger a global depression worse than anything in history.
And listen, don't just take my word for it. This isn't science fiction. The Brookings Institution says that even just getting close to a default causes significant damage. An actual default would be an economic wound we inflict on ourselves, and it would be absolutely apocalyptic.
Now, you often hear people compare the national debt to a family's credit card debt. You know, the government needs to tighten its belt. But that analogy just doesn't work, and here's why. A government isn't a household. Unlike you or me, it can raise its own income by changing tax laws. It can influence interest rates. And, maybe most importantly, it basically lives forever. It doesn't need to pay off its entire mortgage by a certain date.
So when you peel it all back, the real debate isn't just about some scary $36 trillion number. It's about our priorities as a country. The debt is a reflection of decades of promises we've made to ourselves. Promises to fund things like Social Security, Medicare, and a strong national defense. The real question we have to ask is, can future generations afford the promises we've made today? And should they have to? That's the real debate.